task force makes it to the W camp. The Germans surround it and basically annihilate it. The soldiers that have been sent to do this rescue are going to end up in the POW camp with the other POWs.
So Patton had succeeded not only in keeping Waters in a POW long after everybody else was liberated, he was among the last to get liberated, and then risk the lives of 307 to liberate one man, essentially, was the result of his love for his daughter.
Example of George Patton doing something recklessly. What illustrates that George Patton was a thief?
World War II sees the real and the mythical Patton line up almost perfectly. He conquers in battle, then falls from grace, the victim of his own misconduct. And finally, wins redemption by securing the ultimate victory.
It's almost as if a team of great screenplay writers sat down and crafted a screenplay, the perfect idea of a general fighting in the American military during the Second World War.
It's also proof that we can live up to self-created myth and make history in the process. A renowned Civil War general had none of Patton's flair, but he was one of the most popular Americans of the 19th century. But as it turns out, much of what we know of him is fiction, because the facts have succeeded. Like Patton, Ulysses S. excelled it. But Patton loved it. In his memoir, he observed something that historians would agree with. Some people are told and are believed to be true. And that's especially true about Grant's. Grant's story is usually told this way. Writing from what. Also tales of armor and business. But Scott posed a story to read the army during the Civil War. And rise to become the Union's most successful advantage in southern armies. He earns reputation and crushes Robert E. Lee rebel force, allowing his own men to be slaughtered in a bloody war of attrition.
He's brutal. He's superior as a general.
Grant's weakness is his drink, and he loses many a battle after his unfought. But he stays so long enough to force Lee to surrender in 865, and within 3 years, he becomes president of the United States. That yarns myths out for the stars on the Confederate flag, starting with the idea that Grant was a notorious drunk.
No, Grant was never on duty during the Civil War. He never under the influence of alcohol during active operations. In operations.
If all the evidence says no, why is Grant's chronic drinking so widely accepted? It all starts when he is a young Army officer in California, 1853. He doesn't drink any more than his colleague, but a guy only 5'8" with a small frame, drinking often one too many.
Grant seems very strongly affected by alcohol. So here's a single drink would make him flushed and drowsy.
With one drink, he would start to slur his words. With drinks, he would start to wander and waddle as he walked down the street.
When Grant can't hold his liquor, he gets caught up. His commander threatens him with a court-martial. Already disillusioned in the army, Grant resigns his commission in 1854. The entire affair is for years. In 1861, 7 years later, Grant rejoins the Army for the Civil War and shows a knack for commanding inexperienced volunteer soldiers. He impresses his superiors with their skill and rapidly climbs up the ranks.
When the Civil War began, and Grant started vaulting over the officers that had been ahead of him earlier in his career, they began to get jealous. And they remembered these stories about Grant's drinking.
So whenever Grant suffers a military setback during the war, his army rivals say it's because he's fallen off the wagon, and the stories gained so much traction over the next century that they could be seen as facts. Just like it's accepted that Grant was a notorious drunk, it's also assumed that the general who won the Civil War was opposed to slavery. Yes, no doubt about it. But there's a bizarre irony. Grant owned a slave. Before the war, he runs the Missouri farm of his slave-owning father-in-law, and he's given a slave named William Jones. Grant is the last slave-owning president. In all, 12 owned slaves, 8 of them while they occupied the White House. But Grant acts nothing like the typical plantation owner. He works side by side in the field with Jones, enraging the neighboring farmers.
And when the farm failed and Grant gave it up, he freed that slave. Now, slaves were worth a lot of money, and Grant sure could have used the money because he was down on his luck. And he freed the slave voluntarily, let the money go. That says something about what he thought about slavery.
As poor as he was, as struggling as he was as a businessman and a farmer, he was not going to cash in on the value of that human being.
For more than a century, the myth makers have been cashing in on the biggest legend of all about Grant. Damning charge made by both North and South.
But the real facts aren't blue or gray. They're black and white. Ulysses Grant witnessed some of history's bloodiest battles, which was all the more difficult for him because he couldn't stand the sight of blood. Even looking at a rare steak would make him sick.
Pretty ironic for the general who won the Civil War by being an infamous butcher, right?
One of the biggest myths about Grant is that he won his victories by overwhelming his enemies with massively superior manpower, and that he just pushed these troops into battle to be mowed down, but eventually just to smother his enemies. That he was, in short, a butcher who didn't care about human life, and not to be far from the truth.
Grant's casualties were smaller as a proportion of his forces than Lee's were. And this despite the fact that Grant was almost always fighting from outside defensive works. Lee typically fought from defensive positions. And so the attacker almost always suffers greater casualties than the defender.
Throughout all his campaigns, you can see that Grant maneuvers skillfully, and that his goal is to win by maneuver, not by throwing masses of troops at the enemy. Now, Grant's a fighter. He will fight, especially if you get him up against another real combative fighter like Robert E. Lee. You get those two going at each other, they will slug it out. We will have very considerable casualty risks on both sides of the line. But Grant wasn't a butcher.
So why do we always hear that he was? Surprisingly, the myth starts not in the South, but in the North. In the wake of every major battle under Grant's watch, the long list of Union casualties sparks outrage from Union newspapers, and they blame Grant for the carnage.
They want the South killed, but they don't want any Northerners killed. It's the kind of very contemporary feeling, belief that only the bad guys are supposed to die in a war, not our people.
But after the war, the defeated South also labels Grant a butcher, transforming the myth into gospel.
It's often said that the victors write the histories. That wasn't the case in the Civil War. The Civil War was the losers that wrote the histories. For a long time, the Southern interpretation of the Civil War was the one that gained a foothold in the American consciousness.
With their slave-based empire in ruins, Southern historians are driven to answer the most basic of questions. Why did we fight? And how did we lose? Their answers, which cast Grant as the war's greatest scoundrel, comes to be known as the Lost Cause.
The myth of the lost cause is the idea that the Confederacy was right. And that view has been one of the Confederacy as a noble cause, which had nothing to do with slavery, supposedly, and which was just about noblemen fighting for their freedom. And when you accept that view of the Confederacy, then Grant comes out looking like, well, a villain.
The Lost Cause is perpetuated not just in history books, but in movies from Birth of a Nation to Gone with the Wind. The myth virtually deifies Robert E. Lee, portraying him as a military genius
and a model of Southern gallantry. Grant, on the other hand, his nemesis, is the butcher, a barbarian who wins not because he has justice and God on his side, but only because he has the most guns, cannons, and soldiers.
Grant was magnanimous in victory, and yet least grace in defeat is what is celebrated more. So the myth of the Lost Cause certainly has not pictured Grant in a very favorable way.
But after Grant wins Lee's surrender, no myth can undermine his popularity as the savior of the Union. And a grateful nation makes him its president. There will always be a battle between history's spin doctors. But in the end, it's the truth that triumphs. We all think we know American history, but sometimes the strength of our myths simply overpower the truth. Did you know that the way we once pledged allegiance to the flag would have put a twinkle in the murderous eye of Adolf Hitler? Or that Mount Rushmore's sculptor blew up one incomplete presidential head with dynamite? And would you believe the Statue of Liberty was originally headed for Egypt? I'm Jamie Taylor. Let's do a little unorthodox flag waving. Take a hard look at George Washington's nose and get under the skin of our favorite 150-foot woman on our quest for the truth. It's a superstar of our national treasures. It has its own anthem, its own Pledge of Allegiance, laws that protect it. It is, of course, the American flag. But if you think you know the truth about Old Glory, well, get ready for some red, white, and blue revelations. Here's the commonplace story. In June of 1776, George Washington visits Philadelphia seamstress Betsy Ross and asks her to make the first American flag. She consents and sews the icon that will be the template for all U.S. flags to come. The Patriots immediately embrace it. The flag rallies Washington's troops in many a Revolutionary War battle. And the newly independent United States has a symbol it protects with nearly religious fervor. If you believe all that, you've got stars in your eyes. Let's start with the Betsy Ross part. Betsy attended the same Philadelphia church as Washington and Ben Franklin. But as for making the flag, the problem is that there's no direct evidence to support it. We believe in the story of Betsy Ross because of something her grandson wrote 100 years after the fact. In 1870, Betsy Ross's grandson, William Canby, claims that his grandmother fashioned the first flag. His sole evidence is stories passed down through the family. And the legend catches on.
At best, she may have had an indirect involvement, perhaps redesigning the stars from 6 points to 5 points. That's about it.
If Betsy Ross didn't design the flag, well, who did? If anyone was directly involved in the creation of the flag, it was Francis Hopkinson. Hopkinson is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and an early federal employee.
The committee for the Navy needed to develop something to distinguish American ships in this new entity called the United States of America. The ships are out sailing in the ocean. How are you going to recognize them? They need someone to create a symbol that projects that identity so other people can know if it's a friend or foe.
And as for the part about the flag immediately becoming the near sacred symbol we now revere,
The American flag was not considered a very important symbol of the country. There was no universal design whatsoever. The arrangement of stars varied, sometimes as a circle, sometimes as an oval, sometimes in rows, and different flags actually had different number of stripes, as few as 9 and as many as 18 in the early American flag.
Still, we've seen the movies and the paintings. The flag rallies our troops during the darkest moments of the Revolution, doesn't it? Just like George Washington, I cannot tell a lie.
The American flag was not flown in any battle of the Revolutionary War. As far as we know, it was not flown until the 1840s in the Mexican-American War.
But what about those paintings? 19th century artists put the flag into their paintings, not to be historically accurate, but to be patriotic. The American flag doesn't become a powerful symbol until the bloodbath of our Civil War. Old Glory flies proudly during the Union's unsuccessful defense of Fort Sumter. The flag finally spreads across the country as a beacon of patriotism and unity that stands tall even in defeat.
The flag was adopted by the American military only late in the 1800s. The Marines didn't adopt it until 1876, and the American cavalry until 1887.
Nevertheless, Americans have been pledging allegiance to the flag, hand over heart, since our nation's early years. Not exactly. The Pledge of Allegiance wasn't even created until 1892.
Tons of immigrants are coming into America. We need something to bind these people together. If they don't have a shared history, we pledge allegiance to the flag. That this is the symbol of our country, and there's this ritual, basically, to bring people all into the fold.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
And the way we pledge allegiance changes in 1942, during the Second World War.
The original salute was very similar, unfortunately, to the Nazi salute, with the arm outstretched and the palm up. That, of course, was characterized of the horrific Nazi era in Germany. And as a result of that, of course, the salute was changed to putting one's right hand over one's heart.
There's a way in which America, especially because it's such a young nation, needs symbols, heroes, artifacts, things that give it kind of an identity. That's why the flag is invested with a tremendous amount of meaning.
If the American flag is so cloaked in meaning and myth, what about a mammoth stone carving created by blasting away 450,000 tons of rock? And did you know these four guys almost shared their mountain with a woman? In 1937, while workers are still carving Mount Rushmore's presidential faces, a congressional bill calls for another head. That of suffragette Susan B. Anthony. But she doesn't make it. The motion is defeated. The argument being that it was going to cost too much. How many other surprises await in the Black Hills of South Dakota as we chisel the fictions from the hard stone of fact? Let's start with what we know. In South Dakota, sculptor Gutzon Borglum conceives of a great monument carved out of granite. The heads of 4 U.S. presidents, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. Carving the heads starts in 1927 and ends